I'm not actually sure if anyone heard any of that because I may or may not have forgotten to turn the microphone on until now. So, I mean, people on TikTok probably heard me because they're not actually picking up this. But everyone on YouTube might have just been listening to about 3 minutes of silence. So, yeah, I'm new to this if this was unclear to anybody. All right. Just touch the gain a little bit. Okay, that should probably be good. All right. I'm going to crack on at this point. It is 6 o'clock. It is Sunday. Story time. So, if you are just joining up, this again is from Prospero Burns, which was written by, I believe this was written by Dan Abnett. Um, yes, written for Black Library by Dan Abnett. If you don't know who Dan Abnett is, he's a very prolific sci-fi writer, and fantasy writer. But he has a really sort of unique way of using words that I happen to particularly enjoy. So I hope everyone likes this. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, At the Turning of Spring. Death had them surrounded. It had come to cut threads, and today it wore 4 faces. A burning death for those too hurt or too afraid to flee the settlement as the firestorm swept through it. A freezing death for those who ran away up the scarp to escape the murder make. Even in spring, the wind came in off the ice flats with a death edge that sucked an exposed man's life heat out through his lungs and rotted his hands and feet into black twigs and left him as a stiff, stone-hard bundle covered in rime. For others, a drowning death if they attempted to flee across the blue ice around the spit. Spring's touch was already working the sea ice loose against the shore like a tooth in a gum. The ice would no longer take a man's weight, not reliably. If the ice broke under you, down you went. Fast and straight if you plunged through. Slow and screaming if an ice plate tipped and slid you in. Either way, the water was oil black, and so cold it would freeze the thoughts in your brain before your lungs were even empty. For the rest, for those who had remained to fight, a bloody death. The death of the murder make. This was the death that knocked you down hard onto the ice with an axe or a maul, so you felt nothing except the cold burn of the ice and the hot burn of your own blood, and the pain scream of your crippling wound. This was the death that stood over you and knocked you again and as many times as necessary until you would not rise again, or until you were so disfigured that death could no longer bear to look at you, and moved off in disgust to find another soul to knock. Whoop, stay with me, microphone. Eh. This is one of the problems of having a small booth, and you trip over your own mic stand from time to time. Where was I? Any of those 4 faces would cut your thread as soon as look at you, and those were the faces the Bolt were wearing. The Bolt. The Bolt had brought the murder make down on the Askamani Ite. 20 boat. It was early in the season for a raid. A man had to be desperate to go out making red snow when he could wait for the first grasses in milder weather. 20 boat, and all of them still rigged for ice running under their sea sails. If there had been time, the Askamani might have wondered why their doom had come so early. Ironland, where the Bolt had settled, had persisted 20 great years, but many now said its roots were soft. Many now said it would only be one more summer, 2 at the most, before the ocean sucked it down again into the World Forge. Askamani land ran from the Spithead to the ice shelf, and was poor for farming and lacked natural defenses, but it was yet just 1 great year old, and the Dowsers had one of these days I'll figure out how to talk. And the Dowsers had proclaimed it strong land with many years left in it. So, land thirst. Perhaps it was that. Fifth knew better. Nothing got the murder urge pumping like fear, and nothing stoked up fear like a bad omen. A broom star. A day star, color in the ice, bloom in the sea, smoke out on the ice shelf where no settlement was, some dead thing washed up that should not be, something born to livestock or to a woman that should not be, something with birth defects. Sometimes a bad dream would be enough to do it. A bad dream that told you the tribe down the coast or around the headland was Maleficarum. You let Landthirst be your excuse as you reached for your shirt and your blade, but you made sure the Gothi marked your face in soot glue with good cast-out marks like the sun disk and the warding eye before you opened out your sails. And there had been a bad omen, all right. Fifth had seen it. Fifth had seen the make coming, too. He'd seen the sails approaching along the inshore early enough to blow the scream horn, but too late for it to do any good. He had merely enabled his kinfolk to die awake. The Balt main force had come up around the spit in their worm boats in the sightless pre-dawn gray, sailing black sails straight out of the water and onto the shore ice on their rigs, translating from watercraft to icecraft with barely a jolt. Their skirmishers had put ashore on the far side of the headland and had come romping in over the high back of the snow dunes to fall on the Askamani settlement from the hind side. After that, it had been fire and knocking. The Balt were mongrel big, men with long faces and beards waxed into sun rays under their spectacle face helms. They were horribly able with talking. Not my strongest suit, apparently. They were horribly able with axe and maul, and the occasional high-status sword that some carried. But they brought with them none of the screaming vigor of a normal Balt raid or murder make. They were silent, terrified of what they had come to kill, terrified of its sky magic. They were silent and grim, and set to murder everything to wipe the magic away. Men, women, the young, livestock, nothing was spared a knock. There was not a shred of mercy. There was not a moment's thought to claim prisoners or take slaves. Askamani girls were famously fine-looking, and there were plenty of healthy girl children, too, who would make valuable breeding slaves in time. But the Balt had put away all appetites, except for a fierce desire to be cleansed of fear. The sound of an axe knocking in is a wet smack of slicing meat and shattering bone, like sapwood being cut. A maul makes a fat, bruising sound like a mattock driving pegs into marsh loam or wet ice. Worse than both are the after sounds, the screaming of the agonized, the ruined, and the dying, the begging shrieks of the hurt and maimed, the hacking impacts of death knocking until the fallen stop being alive, or stop trying to rise, or stop screaming, or stop being in one piece. Fifth had just enough time to get his shirt on and loft his axe. Several other Hersers fell to arms with him, and they met the first skirmishers coming in through the walls and window slits of the settlement head on. The panic was already up. It was blind, blundering in the dark, a reek of urine, the first noseful of smoke. Fifth's axe was balanced for a single hand. It was a piece of proper craft with a high-carbon head that weighed as much as a decent newborn boy. From the toe of the blade to the heel of the beard, it had a smile on it wider than a man's handspan, and it had kissed a whetstone just the night before. The axe is a simple machine, a lever that multiplies the force from your arm into the force delivered by the blade. The rudiments apply whether you're splitting wood or men. Fifth's axe was a bone cutter, a shield breaker, a helm cleaver, a death edge, a cutter of threads. He was a Herser of the Askamani Ite, and he knew how to stand his ground. It was a throttle fight in the settlement itself. Fifth knocked two Balts back out of the tent wall, but the tight confines were choking his swing. He knew he needed to get out. He yelled to the Hersers with him, and they pulled back. They got out of the tents and into the settlement yard, wrapped in swirling black smoke, and went eye to eye with the bolts in their spectacle helms. It was mayhem, a free-for-all. Blades swung like windmills in a storm. Fenk went down as a bolt axe split his left calf lengthwise. He bawled in rage. As his leg gave out, useless. Seconds later, a maul knocked his head sidelong, snapping his neck and his thread. He flopped down on the earth, his shattered skull bag leaking blood. Fifth drove off a bolt with a mattock, scared him back with the whistling circles of his swinging axe. Gedge tried to cover Fifth's flank, using the basics of shield wall tactics, but Gedge had not had time to collect a decent shield from the stack, just a tattered practice square from the training field. A bolt spear punctured right through him, tore him open so thoroughly his guts spilled out onto the snow like ropes of sausage. Gedge tried to catch them as though he could gather them up and put them back inside himself and everything would be all right again. They steamed in the spring air. He squealed in dismayed pain. He couldn't help himself. He knew he was ruined unto death. He looked at Fifth as he squealed again. It wasn't the pain. He was so angry that he was irreparably dead. Fifth put mercy into his stroke. Fifth turned away from his last picture of Gedge and saw that there were fingers scattered on the snow that had been churned up by the scrambling and sliding feet, along with blood by the bowlful. They were the fingers of women and children, from hands held up to protect themselves. Defensive wounds. There on the snow, a complete hand, the tiny hand of a child, perfect and whole. Fifth recognized the mark on the ring. He knew the child the hand had once belonged to. He knew the father the child had once belonged to. Fifth felt the red smoke blow up in his head. A bolt came at him, silent and intent. Fifth flexed the lever of his axe, hooked it in, and made a ravine of the bolt's face. 4 Hersers left: Fifth, Guthux, Lern, and Brom. No sign of the Ite chief. The chief was probably dead and face down in the red snow with his huskarls. Fifth could smell blood. It was overpoweringly strong, a hot copper reek spicing the freezing dawn air. He could smell Gedge's insides, too. He could smell the inner parts of him, the ruptured stomach, the yellow fat of his belly meat, the heat of his life. Fifth knew it was time to go. The Uplander was in the furthest shelter. Even the Askamani knew to keep him away from people. The Uplander was propped against cushions. "Listen to me," Fifth hissed. "Do you understand me?" "I understand you. My translator is working," the Uplander replied, looking pale. "The bolt are here. 20 boat. They will knock you dead. Tell me, do you want the mercy of my axe now?" "No, I want to live." "Then can you walk?" "Perhaps," the Uplander replied. "Just don't leave me here. I'm afraid of wolves." There are no wolves on Fenris. When the Uplander had been told this years before, he'd laughed. He had heard it from a venerated scholar and conservator, later celebrated iterator called Kirill Cinderman. The Uplander, not long graduated with distinction from the Universitariat of Sardis, had won a coveted place on an 8-month field mission to audit and preserve some of the arcane data cores of Neo-Alexandria, before sandstorms and scorching radiation squalls erased the precious ruins into the melancholy emptiness of the Nord-Afric zone forever. This was many decades before the Uplander decided to go to Fenris, or call himself Ahmad ibn Rusta. Back then, he was 25 years old and known to his friends as Casper. Cinderman learned his name early on. Cinderman wasn't the project head. He had been sent in for a 3-week consult, but he was not afraid to get his hands dirty or to mix with the junior team members. He had an easy way with people. Names were important. One evening, The team had fallen, according to their habit, into discussion over supper in the project space, a modular station overlooking the library ruins. They were all exhausted. Everyone had been working inadvisably long shifts to get the mission accomplished. No one wanted to see the precious digital memories that lingered in the ruins lost for all time. So, everybody was sandburned, and everybody was sleep deprived, and everybody had lost significant body mass to water debt. The nights should have been time for restorative rest, but they had found their dreams populated by the data ghosts of Neo Alexandria, talkative phantoms that would not let the living slumber undisturbed. So they stayed up to keep the phantoms out, and the nights became time for tired companionship and reflection as the ablative winds howled in over the radgrave of Neo Alexandria and assaulted the station's bolted storm shutters. Drink your water, kids. They talked about everything, just to stay awake. Cinderman, perhaps the greatest polymath the Uplander would ever have the honor of knowing in his long life, had a tireless tongue. The older team members talked about the various places they had visited in the courses of their careers, and the younger members talked of places they still wanted or hoped to visit. This led, inevitably, to the concoction of an ultimate wish list, a dream itinerary of the places in creation that any scholar, historian, or remembrancer would give great wealth or a body part just to glimpse. It was a list of the universe's secret places, its remote wonders, its enigmatic corners, its rumored sites and mythical locales. Fenris was one such. Ironically, given what the Uplander would witness towards the end of one of his lives, Tizca was another. Cinderman, though even then a man of great age and experience, had not been to Fenris himself. The number of outsiders who had ever gone to Fenris was alarmingly small. But then, as Cinderman put it, Fenris did not welcome visitors, nor was it a gracious host. Thanks to its extreme conditions, even a well-prepared man might be lucky to survive a few hours on its open surface. Still, he had said to them, think of all that ice. It had sometimes reached 40 degrees in the station at night, at least that when the climate control center packed up. They had all groaned at Cinderman's tormenting words. Then, apropos of nothing in particular, Cinderman made the remark about the wolves, a remark that had been passed to him down such a long relay of other travelers and historians, its provenance was obscure. There are no wolves on Fenris, he had said. The Uplander had smiled, expecting some droll witticism to follow. His smile had covered the shiver he had felt. Except, of course, for the wolves, sir, he had replied. Exactly, Caspar, the old man said. Shortly afterwards, the subject had changed, and the remark had been forgotten. Fifth didn't much want to touch the Uplander, but he wasn't going to walk far without an arm around his ribs. He hoisted the man up, and the Uplander groaned at the jolt. What are you doing? Brom yelled. Leave him! Fifth scowled. Brom knew better than that. It wasn't that Fifth wanted to drag the Uplander around, but that was the thing with omens. You didn't invite them into your ite, but once they were in, you couldn't ignore them. Fifth could no more leave the Uplander lying there than the Balt could have refused to set out on the murder make that midnight. Lern stepped up and helped Fifth handle the injured man. The shelters of the ite were ablaze and choking the pale dawn sky with fat rivers of black smoke. The Balt hadn't finished cutting threads. Sharp screams of anguish and pain split the air like arrows. They ran They ran along the edge of the scarp, stumbling with the burden of the injured man. Guthix and Brom followed them, snow running with wide, splayed steps. Brom had got a spear from somewhere. A gang of Balt took off after them, chasing like hunting dogs across the snow, hunched and loping. Excuse me. Guthix and Brom turned to meet them. Guthix's axe knocked the first one onto his back, and a jet of blood squirted out in a 5-meter arc across the snow. Brom's spear tip found the cheek of another Balt and tore it like cloth. digging out teeth that popped free like kernels of corn. Brom clubbed his victim dead with the butt of his spear shaft as the man fell down, holding his face. The bolt circled and danced away from Brom's jabbing spear. Fifth left Lern with the Uplander's weight and turned back. He came past Brom in a screaming charge and lopped off the top of a bolt's skull with his circling axe. That shook things up. Spear or no spear, the bolt went for them. They tried to use their shields to get the spear out of their faces. One of them immediately took the spear in the breastbone. It made a dry branch crack as the iron head went in, and the man puked blood. But the spear was wedged, and the bolt's dead weight wrenched it out of Brom's hand. He scrambled back with nothing but a long knife to guard himself. Guthix used his axe to break a shield and the arm holding it, then felled the bolt with a neck wound. He turned to fend off a bearded bolt axe with the cheek of his own, but the bolt was big and strong, and drove Guthix onto his heels with a series of relentless knocks. Fifth still had momentum. His charge ran down two more bolt, one of which he left bleeding to death, the other dazed, and he turned in time to rescue Guthix by burying the toe point of his axe through the spine of the big bolt hacking at him. Fifth jerked the axe out with a snarl, and the bolt collapsed on his face. Brom was finishing another with angry, repeated stabs. The bolt had wounded Brom on his first pass, but had then made the mistake of getting too close to the Herser's long knife. They ran back to where Lern was toiling with the Uplander. Brom had recovered his spear, but he was leaving red snow behind him. The Uplander was panting with effort. Heat was steaming out of his Luthith right. Heat was steaming out of his loose, gasping mouth. Under his storm cloak, the Uplander wore garments made from fabrics unfamiliar to Fifth or his kinsmen. The skyfall had hurt the Uplander. Broken some bones was Fifth's guess, though Fifth had never seen an Uplander opened up to know if they worked the same way inside as Ascomani or Balt or any other Ite kind. Fifth had never seen an Uplander before. He'd never been tied up in an omen this bad. He wondered what had become of the Ite's Gothi. The Gothi was supposed to be wise, and he was supposed to use that wisdom to steer and safeguard the weird of the Ite. Fine job he'd done. The Gothi had not known what to make of the Uplander when the Hersers had first brought him in from the crash site, and he hadn't known what to do after that, except shake his bone jangles and his rattle full of fish teeth, and beseech the spirits with the same old tired chants, pleading with them to come down from Upland and take back their lost kinsmen. Fifth believed in the spirits. He firmly believed. He believed in Upland above, where the spirits lived, and the Underverse below, where the Wights went. They were the only thing a man had to cling to in the changing landscape of the mortal world. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew there were times, especially when a man's thread was pulled so thin it might snap, that you had to make your own weird. 3 bowshots away from the Ite, the Ascomani kept a basin for their boats. It was a little ice crater open to the sea on the north head, and they had better than 10 boat in it. Most were up on blocks, hoisted from the ice, so the men could labor in daylight hours to remove the rigs ready for the spring waters. But one was the Ite Chief's boat, ready to run at a moment's nod. It was called keeping it knocked. You knocked the cleft of an arrow against a bowstring, ready for tension, ready to fly. The chief's wormboat stood on its rudders on the hard ice, its sails ready to drop and fill, checked only by the anchor lines. "Into the boat," Fifth ordered as they scrambled down the slope to the basin edge. "Which boat?" asked Lern. "The chief's boat," Fifth snapped. "But it's the chief's boat," Guthix said, wary. "He's not going to be needing it," said Fifth. "Not as much as we do, anyway." Guthix looked at him blankly. "The chief's sleeping on the red snow, you asshole," said Fifth. "Now get in the boat." They got into the boat and laid the Uplander down in the bow. The bolt began to appear at the crest of the slope. The Hersers heard the first air buzz. Heard the air buzz of the first arrows. Fifth dropped the sea sails, and they filled in an instant. The canvas cracked like thunder as it took the world's breath. There was a hard snow wind that morning, and he'd barely noticed it. The anchor lines creaked and strained as the wormboat mithered on the ice, impatient to slip. "Cut the lines!" Fifth yelled out. Guthix looked at him from the stern, where the wind pull was chafing the taut lines against the rail. "He's really not coming?" he asked. "Who?" "The chief. You saw his thread cut?" "He'd be here if he was coming," said Fifth. They heard cracking sounds like green wood spitting in a fire. The iron heads of arrows were smacking into the ice around them, drilling up puffs of ice dust or cracking punctures into the blue-black glass of the crust. 2 arrows hit the boat. One went into the mainmast as deep as the length of a man's forearm. "Cut the lines!" Fifth yelled. Guthix and Lern cut the lines with their axes. The wormboat took off like an escaping animal, its sails bellied out full and as rigid as iron. The lurch shook them on their feet. The bladed runners of the ice rig shrieked as they scratched across the marble ice of the basin. Lern took the helm. He was the best steersman of them. He draped his armpit over the tiller, loading it with his weight to drive the blade of the sternpost rudder into the ice, and balanced the tension of the ropes coming from the quarter rudders, one in each fist. Steering a rigger was a battle of muscle and wit. One bad judgment, one overlight feathering of the quarters, one heavy-handed dig of the main blade, and the combination of polished ice and raw wind shear could tumble even the biggest wormboat and knock it into kindling. They left the basin. They went out through the sea cut in the granite lip that led out onto the open water. But it wasn't water. It was long past the great year's glacial maximum, and time was turning. But this stretch of sea along the shadowed inlet remained the sky's looking-glass. In some places, it was gray-green like an old mirror. In others, blue like uncut sapphire. In others, bright and clear like fine crystal. But everywhere, it was thick to a depth 2 or 3 times the height of a man. As soon as they were clear of the basin, and the boat's runners were shrieking across the surface of the mirror sea like the baleful voices of the wights of the underverse, the cold hit them. It was the open cold, the cold of the dull, iron-hard end of winter, the blunt cold of the open ice range. All of them gasped at the shock of it, and immediately laced up their collars or wrapped up scarf bindings to protect their mouths and noses. Fifth looked at the Uplander sprawled in the bow. He was panting from a combination of pain and exertion, and the breath heat was steaming out of him in great spectral clouds that the wind was stripping away. Fifth moved down the vibrating wormboat towards him, walking with the practiced rolling gait of an experienced ice mariner. "Cover up your mouth!" he shouted. The Uplander looked at him blankly. "Cover up your mouth! Breathe through your nose!" "What?" Fifth knelt down beside him. "The heat'll bleed right out of you with your mouth open like that. Breathe through your nose. Conserve it." He opened up one of the woven grass coffers tucked in under the boat's rail and pulled out a blanket and some furs. They were all stiff with cold, but he shook them out and swaddled the Uplander in them. "Through your nose," he reminded. "Don't you know that? Don't you know the cold?" "No." "Then why the hell would you come to this land if you didn't know all the ways it would try to kill you?" The Uplander had no answer. He couldn't summon the effort. Renewed pain was gripping him, and it was extraordinarily comprehensive. It pinned his thoughts and refused to allow him even a small reserve of mental power to use for other things. He'd never known pain like it, except perhaps once. He could hear a clavier playing. The keys were ringing out a cheerful music hall melody that he could just pick out above the screaming of the runners and the roaring of the brutish crew. He could hear a clavier playing, and he knew he ought to know why. The Balt came after them. 1 second. The Balt came after them. Lern shouted out as soon as he spotted them and pointed astern. Wormboats were skating out from around the spithead. They were black sailboats, rigged for a murder make by night. The Balt were resolved to see the make through to its bloody end. Fifth had hoped the bolt might give up once the main raid on the Ite was over. But no, the bolt had to be terrified to keep up the pursuit. They weren't going to rest until everyone was dead. What had their Gothi told them, Fifth wondered? What interpretation had he spouted that night when the broom star had sliced the sky, a ribbon of light that had left an accusatory glowing scar directly over Askamani territory? How had he explained the landfall, the noise shock of the star hitting ice? What had he told his wide-eyed Hersers, his chief, the Balt womenfolk, the children woken up and crying because of the noise? Fifth had seen the Balt Gothi once, 3 great years back, at a time when the Balt and the Askamani had been on trading terms, when they could visit Ite to Ite for a barter mate with cargoes of pelts and grass weave and smoked meat, and exchange them for preserved herbs, lamp oil, whale fat candles, and ingots of pig iron. There had been a formal meeting of the chiefs with an exchange of gifts, a lot of bowing, a lot of long-winded rehearsal of lineage and bloodline from the Scalds, and a lot of blowing of the Balt's bronze horns, which made a sound half like a sea cave echo and half like a muffled fart. The Balt Gothi had been skinny, taller than a warbow and twice as thin, as the saying went, with a heavy jaw like that of a mule horse or a simpleton. There were so many metal piercings in his lips and nose and ears, he looked as if he had been plagued with boils and cold sores. He had a wand made of a bear's arm blade and a silver torque. Someone had braided seabird feathers into his long, lank hair so that they made a white mantle around his bony shoulders. His voice was thin and reedy. His name was Hunor. He spoke sense, though. During the barter make, Fifth had come to the Gothi's shelter, joined the listeners sharing the fire, and listened to him talk. The Balt Gothi knew how the world worked. He talked plainly about the verse and the underverse, as if he had been told their secrets by the whites themselves. The Askamani Gothi was a crazy brute. He had fits, and he smelled like a sea cow, both of which factors had probably led to his election as Gothi. He was good with stars, Fifth had to give him that. It was as if he could hear the noise their rigs made as they skated around the glass of the sky. But the rest of the time he was foul-tempered and raving. His name was Iolo. At the barter make, Iolo and Hunor had squared up to one another, sniffed and growled like rutting bull seals, and then spent the whole time trying to steal one another's secrets. But it had also been as if they were afraid of one another. It was as if, in trying to steal one another's secrets, they were afraid that they were risking infection. That was how it went with magic. Magic had an underside. Magic could transform a man's life, but it could corrupt it too, especially if you weren't careful, if you didn't watch it and soothe it and keep it sweet. Magic had a nasty undercurrent that could infect a man if he wasn't paying attention. Magic could turn nasty. Magic could turn on you, even if you were the most exact and painstaking practitioner or Gothi. The worst magic of all, that was sky magic, and it was sky magic that was riding in the bow of their wormboat. Fifth wondered what the Balt Gothi had said to his people to get them so fired up. Lern swung them west, down the mirror throat of the inlet, under the shadow of the Spithead cliffs, and out onto the ice field, the apron of the Great Glacier. Ice was better than water. The same area of sail could invest you with 10 times the speed, but the effort was mighty. Fifth knew they'd have to change steersman in another hour, or stop to let Lern rest, because the concentration was so intense. Already, Lern's eyes looked drawn, what Fifth could see of them over the lip of his collar. They cut up across a long strake of ice field the color of gray fish scales, and passed through the collar ridges where glacial moraines of broken rock pushed up through the ice of the glass like extrusions of deformed bone. The Balt boats were steadily falling behind. A good Balt boat was one thing, axe carved from ocean wood and whale bones, but a good Askamani boat was quite another, especially a fine rig built for an Ite's chief. They might live yet. It was a fragile thought, and Fifth hated himself for even thinking it, and thus jinxing it. But it was real. They might yet outrun the Balt's murder make and find sanctuary. The Radkana, they were the best hope. The Radkana were a major power in the west, with several ites along the jagged backbone of the ice field, less than a day away. More important, a peacemaking understanding had endured between the Radkana and the Askamani for the lifetimes of the last 6 chiefs. Most important of all, the Radkana and the Balt had quarreled and made red snow on and off for 10 generations. When Guthix saw the first Radkana sails ahead, Fifth's spirit lifted. Some beacon lookout had seen them raking in across the ice field and sent a horn blast down the chain, and the Radkana chief had ordered out his wormboats to greet and assist the Askamani visitor. Then he realized, with a sinking feeling, that the explanation didn't fit the facts. "We're too far out," he murmured. "What?" Brom asked. He was trying to sew his cut up with fishing wire and a bone needle. The work was too fussy for gloves, but the wind chill was too severe for bare hands to function with any finesse. He was making a mess of himself. "We're too far out for any Radkana lookout to have spotted us yet," Fifth said. "They're coming out because they knew we were coming." "Crap," Brom snorted. Fifth looked at the sails of the Radkana boats. Sails were the most distant visible aspect of a boat, so they were often used to declare intention. A straw yellow sail invited trade and barter. A purple sail indicated ite mourning, the cut thread of a chief or a queen. A white sail, like the one dragging Fifth's wormboat, proclaimed open approach and embassy. A black sail, like the ones the Balt had come in under, was a treacherous sail, because it hid its declaration in the night, and thus defied the convention. A red sail was an open announcement of the intention to murder. The Radkana sails were red. Fifth settled down in the rattling bow of the wormboat beside the Uplander. "What are you?" he asked. "What?" "What have you done? Why have you brought this on us?" "I did nothing." Fifth shook his head. "Red sails. Red sails. Gothi has spoken to Gothi through the Underverse. The Balt came at us, now the Radkana come at us too. Who else? Have you turned the whole verse against us, or just against you?" "I don't know what you mean," the Uplander said. "Did you make it your destiny to die here?" asked Fifth. "No." "Well," the Herser replied, "you certainly seem to have put some effort into making it happen." For those of us who are just joining or have no idea what the hell I'm reading, this is Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett. Moving on. It was an exalted place. Even on that pestilential day, with the tail end of the 6-week campaign to take the Boeotian citadel chattering and booming in the distance, there was an odd stillness in the shrine. Caspar Hauser had felt it before, in other places where mankind had focused its worship for unnumbered generations. A cathedral in Silesia, just the shell of it, brittle as paper, rising above the fuming white rubble and slag of the atomic dust bowl. The deep, painted caves in Baluchistan, where a closed priesthood had concealed precious cellulose scrolls inscribed with their sacred mysteries, and thus preserved the essence of their faith through the age of strife. The high monastic refuges in the Caucasus, where scholars and savants fleeing Narthan Duma's pogroms had hidden in exile, forlorn, ascetic outposts perched at such an altitude you could see the expanding hive zones of the Caspian bloc to the east, and the nanotoxic waters of the Pontus Euxinus to the west, and the voice of some forgotten god lingered in the wind and the thin air and the bright sky. The scholars had come out of Duma's pan-Pacific realm with a priceless cargo of data that they had painstakingly liberated from the tyrant's library prior to one of his data purges. Some of that material, rumor suggested, dated from before the golden age of technology. When Hauser and his fellow conservators finally located the refuges, they found them long since extinct. The cargo of data, the books and digital records, had degraded to powder. The more man masters, the more man finds there is to be mastered. The more man learns, the more he remembers he has forgotten. Naveed Mirza had said that. Hauser had never seen eye to eye with Naveed Mirza, and the various associations they'd been forced to make during their careers had fostered a sour and immotile disdain between them. But there was no faulting Mirza's passionate intent. The strength of his calling matched Hauser's. "We have lost more than we know," he said, "and we are losing more all the time. How can we take any pride in our development as a species when we excel at annihilation and fail to maintain even the most rudimentary continuity of knowledge with our ancestors?" Mirza had been with him that day in Boeotia. Both of them had been awarded places on the conservator team by the Unification Council. Neither of them had yet seen their 30th birthday. They were both still young and idealistic in the most vacuous and misguided ways. It rankled with both of them that they had tied in their appointment rather than one winning and one losing. Nevertheless, they were professionals. The vast refinery, 8 kilometers away, had been mined by the retreating Yselti forces, and the resulting fires had blanketed that corner of Terra in lethal black smoke, a roiling, carcinogenic soup of soot-black petrocarbon filth, as thick as oceanic fog and as noxious as a plague pit. The conservators wore sealed body gloves and masks to go in, shambling through the murk with their heavy, wheezing auglung packs in their hands, like suitcases. The packs were linked to the snouts of their masks by wrinkled pachydermic tubes. The grave gods loomed to meet them through the smoke. The gods wore masks too. They stood for a while, looking up at the grave gods, as immobile as the ancient statues. Divine masks of jade and gold and staring moonstone eyes looked down on Hasgard masks of plastek and ceramite and lidless photomech goggles. Mirza said something, just a wet splutter behind his visor. Hauser had never seen anything like the gods in the Boeotian shrine. None of them had. He could hear the visor displays of several team members clicking and humming as they accessed the memories of their datapacks for comparative images. You won't find anything, Hauser thought. He could barely breathe, and it wasn't the tightness of the mask or the spit-stale taste of the Auglung's airflow. He'd scanned the grapheme inscriptions on the shrine wall, and even that quick glance had told them there was nothing there that they'd expected to find. No Altaic root form, no Turkic or Tungusic or Mongolic. The pictures they carried were beginning to gum up in the sooty air, and battery packs were failing left and right. Hauser told 2 of the juniors to take rubbings of the inscriptions instead. They turned their goggles toward him, blank. He had to show them. He cut sheets of wrapping plastic into small squares and used the side of the wax marker brick to scrub over the faint relief of the mural marks. "Like at school," one of the juniors said. "Get on with it," Hauser snapped. He began an examination of his own, adjusting the macular intensity of his goggles. Without laboratory testing, it was impossible to know how long the shrine had stood there. 1,000 years? 10,000? Exposed to the air, it was degrading fast, and the pervasive petrochemical smog was destroying surface detail before his very eyes. He had a desire to be alone for a minute. He went outside, back up the throat of the entranceway. The Boeotian conflict had uncovered this treasure. The site had been exposed by a parcel of wayward submunitions rather than the diligent hand of an archaeologist. But for the war, this treasure would never have been found. And because of the war, it was perishing. Hauser stood at the entrance and put his auglung on the ground beside him. He took a sip of nutrient drink from his mask feeder and cleaned his fogging goggles with hand spray. To the north of his position, the conflict in the Boeotian citadel underlit the horrendous black roof of the sky, a bonfire shaped like a city. The blackness of the vast smoke canopy was all round, as dense as old night itself. Gusting pillars of bright flame came and went in the distance as the smoke shifted. This, he remarked to himself with leaden irony, was what the great era of unification looked like. According to history tracts that were already published and in circulation, that were already being taught in scolums, for God's sake, The glorious Unification Wars had brought the age of strife to an end over a century and a half earlier. Since then, there had been more than 150 years of peace and renewal as the Emperor led the Great Crusade outwards from Terra and courageously reconnected the lost and scattered diaspora of mankind. That's what the history tracks said. Reality was far less tidy. History only recorded broad strokes and general phases of development, and assigned almost arbitrary dates to human accomplishments that had been made in far less definitive installments. The aftershocks of the Unification War still rolled across the face of the planet. Unification had been triumphantly declared at a point where no power or potentate could hope to vanquish the awesome imperial machine, but that hadn't prevented various feudal states, religious adherents, remote nations, or stubborn autocrats from holding out and trying to ring fence and preserve their own little pockets of independence. Many, like the Boeotian Yeselti family, had held out for decades, negotiating and conniving their way around treaties and rapprochement, and every other diplomatic effort designed to bring them under imperial sway. The story demonstrated that the emperor, or his advisors at least, possessed extraordinary patience. In the wake of the Unification War, there had been a strenuous and high-profile effort to resolve conflicts through non-violent means. And the Yeselti were not tyrants or despots. They were simply an ancient royal house eager to maintain their autonomous existence. The emperor allowed them a twilight grace of a century and a half to come to terms, longer than the lifespan of many Terran empires. The story also demonstrated that the emperor's patience was finite, and when it was exhausted, so was his mercy and restraint. The imperial army had advanced into Boeotia to arrest the Yeselti and annex the territory. Hauser's accredited conservator team was one of hundreds assigned to follow the army in, along with flocks of medicae, aid workers, renovators, engineers, and iterators, to pick up the pieces. Hauser's mask mic clicked. Yes? It was one of the juniors. Come inside, Hauser. Mirza's got a theory. In the shrine, Mirza was shining his lamp pack up angled stone flues cut in the walls. Motes of soot tumbled in the beam, revealing by their motion a flow of circulation. Airways. This is in use, he said. What? This isn't a relic. It's old, yes, but it's been in use until very recently. Hauser watched Mirza as he prowled around the shrine. Evidence? Mirza gestured to the faience bowls of various sizes dotted along the lip of the altar step. There are offerings of fish and grain here, also copal resins, myrrh, I believe. Scanners show carbon counts that indicate they're no more than a week old. Any carbon count is compromised in this atmosphere, Hauser replied. The machine's wrong. Besides, look at the state of them. Calcified. The samples have degraded because of the atmosphere, Mirza insisted. Oh, have it both ways, why not? Said Hauser. Just look at this place, Mirza shot back, gesturing with his gloved hands in exasperation. Exactly what are you proposing, then? Asked Hauser. An occulted religious observance conducted outside the fringes of Boeotian society? Or a private order of tradition sanctioned by the Yeselti? I don't know, Mirza replied. But this whole site is guarding something, isn't it? We need to get an excavator in here. We need to get into the recess behind the statues. We need to examine, record, and remove the statues methodically, Hauser said. It will take weeks just to begin the preservation treatments before we can lift them, piece by. I can't wait that long. Well, sorry, Naveed, but that's the way it is, said Hauser. The statues are priceless. They're our first concern for conservation. Yes, they are priceless, Mirza said. He stepped towards the solemn, silent grave gods. The juniors were watching him. A few took sharp breaths as he actually stepped up onto the base of the altar, gingerly placing his foot so as not to dislodge any of the offertory bowls. Get down, Mirza, said one of the seniors. Mirza edged up onto the second step, so he was almost at eye level with some of the gazing gods. They are priceless, he repeated. He raised his right hand and gently indicated the blazing moonstone eyes of the nearest effigy. Look at the eyes. The eyes are so important, don't you think? So telling? He glanced over his shoulder at his anxious audience. Hauser could tell Mirza was smiling despite the hazmask. Get down, Naveed, he said. Look at the eyes, Mirza said, ignoring the instruction. Down through time, they've always meant the same thing to us, haven't they? Come on, it's basic. Someone. Protection? Mumbled one of the juniors awkwardly. I can't hear you, Yenna. Speak up. The eye is the oldest and most culturally diverse apotropaic symbol, said Hauser, hoping to cut to the chase and end Mirza's showboating. Yes, it is, said Mirza. Cass knows. Thank you, Cass. The eye guards things. You put it up for protection. You put it up to ward off evil and harm, and to keep safe the things you hold most precious. His fingertip traced the outline of the unblinking eye again. We've seen this so many times, just variations on the same design. Look at the proportional values. The eye shape, the brow line, this could have been stylized from a Nazar Bonjour or a Wedyat, and it's not a million kilometers away from the Eye of Providence that is so proudly displayed in such places as the Great Seal of the Unification Council. These are gods of aversion. There's no doubt about it. He jumped down from the steps. Some of the party gasped in alarm, but Mirza did not disturb or break any of the precariously placed bowls. Gods of aversion, he said. Keep out. Stay away. Have you finished? Hauser asked. The pupils are pieces of obsidian, Cass, Mirza said eagerly as he came towards Hauser. You get as close as I did. Get your photomech up to decent resolution. You can see that they're carved. A circle around the edge, a dot in the middle, and you know what that is. The circumpunct, Hauser replied quietly. Which represents? Mirza pressed. Just about anything you want it to, said Hauser. The solar disk, gold, circumference, monad, a diacritical mark, the hydrogen atom. Oh, help him out, Yenna, please, Mirza cried. He's just being awkward. The eye of God, said the female junior nervously. The all-seeing singularity. Thank you, Mirza said. He looked directly at Hauser. His eyes, behind the tinted lenses of his goggles, were fierce. It says, keep out. Stay away. I can see you. I can see right into your soul. I can reflect your harm back at you, and I can know what you know. I can read your heart. I can keep you at bay because I am power, and I am knowledge, and I am protection. The statues are priceless, Hauser, but they are gods of aversion. They're guarding something. How valuable is something, do you suppose, that someone would protect with priceless statues? There was silence for a moment. Most of the team shifted uncomfortably. They're a family group, said Hauser quietly. They're a representation of a dynastic line, a portrait in statue form. You can see the gender dimorphism, the height differentials, and the placements, thus determining familial relationships, hierarchies, and obligations. The tallest figure on the highest step, a man and a woman, lofty and most exalted. Below them, children, perhaps 2 generations, with their own extended families and retainers. The first son and first daughter have prominence. It's a record of lineage and descent. They're a family group. But the eyes, Cass, so help me. They are apotropaic, I agree, said Hauser. What could they be guarding? What could be more priceless than a gold and jade effigy of a god king and his queen and his divine sons and daughters? Hauser stepped past Mirza and faced the altar. I'll tell you. The physical remains of a god king and his queen and his divine sons and daughters. It's a tomb. That's what's in the recess. A tomb. Mirza sighed as if deflated. Oh, Cass, he said, you think so small. Hauser sighed, knowing they were about to go round again, but they turned as they heard noises from the entrance. 5 soldiers clattered into the shrine, spearing the gloom with the lamps strapped to their weapons. They were Imperial Army, hussars from the Tupolov Lancers, one of the very oldest regiments. They had left their cybernetic steeds outside the shrine and dismounted to enter. Clear this sight, one of them said. They were in full war armor, combat visors down, frosty green photomech cursors bouncing to and fro along their optical slits. We've got permission to be here, said one of the seniors. Like crap you have, said the hussar. Gather your stuff and get out. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? Mirza exclaimed, pushing forward. Who's your commander? The Emperor of Mankind, replied the hussar. Who's yours, asswipe? There's been a mistake, said Hauser. He reached for his belt pack. 5 saddle carbines slapped up to target him. 5 not beans. 5 lamp beams pinned him like a specimen. Whoa, whoa, Hauser cried. I'm just reaching for my accreditation. He took out the passpad and flicked it on. The holographic credentials issued by the Unification Council Office of Conservation billowed up into the smoky air, slightly blurred and malformed by the edges of the smoke. Hauser couldn't help but notice the eye of providence on the council seal that flashed up before the data unfurled. That's all very well, said one of the hussars. This is all current, it's valid, said Hauser. Things change, said the hussar. This was personally ratified by Commander Selud, said one of the seniors. He is primary commander, and at 0635 today, Commander Selud was relieved of command by Imperial decree. All permits and authorities are therefore rescinded. Get your stuff, get moving, and live with your disappointment. Why was Selud removed? Asked Mirza. Are you high command? Do you need to know? Sneered one of the hussars. Just unofficially? Unofficially, Selud's made a total clusterfuck of the whole show, said the hussar. 6 weeks and he still manages to let the refinery fields catch fire. The Emperor sent someone in to tidy the whole mess up and draw a line under it. Who? Asked Hauser. Why are these civilians still here? A voice asked. It was deep and penetrating, and it had the hard edges of Vox amplification. A figure had entered the chamber behind the Tupolev Lancers. Hauser wasn't sure how it could have possibly walked in without anyone noticing. It was an Astartes warrior. By the pillars of earth, an Astartes! The Emperor has sent the Astartes to finish this. Hauser felt his chest tighten and his pulse sprint. He had never seen an Astartes in the flesh before. He hadn't realized they were so big. The curvature of the armor plating was immense, oversized, like the grave god statues behind him. The combination of the gloom and his goggles made it hard to resolve color properly. The armor looked red, a bright, almost pale red, the color of the color of watered wine or oxygenated blood. A cloak of fine metal mesh shrouded the warrior's left shoulder and torso. The helmet had a snout like a raven's beak. Hauser wondered what legion the warrior belonged to. He couldn't see any insignia properly. What was it that people were calling them these days, now that the bulk of all Astartes forces had deployed off Terra to spearhead the Great Crusade? Space Marines. That was it, Space Marines. Like the square-jawed heroes of halfpenny picture books. This was no square-jawed hero. This wasn't even human. It was just an implacable thing. A giant twice the size of anybody else in the chamber. Hauser felt he ought to have been able to smell it. The soot on its plating, the machine oil in its complex joints, the perspiration trickling between its skin and its suit liner. But there was nothing. No trace, not even a hint of body heat. It was like the cold but immense blank of the void. Hauser could not imagine anything that could stop it, let alone kill it. I asked a question, the Astartes said. We're clearing them now, sir, stammered one of the lancers. Hurry, the Astartes replied. The hussars started to herd the team towards the entrance. There were a few mumbles of protest, but nothing defiant. Everyone was too cowed by the appearance of the Astartes. The Oglungs were wheezing and pumping more rapidly than before. Please, said Hauser. He took a step towards the Astartes and held out the passpad. Please, we are licensed conservators, see? The hologram relit. The Astartes didn't move. Sir, this is a profound discovery. It is beyond value. It should be preserved for the benefits of future generations. My team has the expertise, the right equipment, too. Please, sir. This area is not safe, said the Astartes. You will remove yourselves. But, sir, I have given you an order, civilian. Sir, which legion do I have the honor of being protected by? The 15th. The 15th. So, the Thousand Sons. What is your name? Hauser turned. The Tupolev Lancers had led most of the team out of the shrine, leaving only him behind. 2 more Astartes, each as immense as the first, had manifested behind him. How could something that big move so stealthily? "What is your name?" the new arrival repeated. "Hauser, sir, Caspar Hauser, conservator, assigned to—" "Is that a joke?" "What?" asked Hauser. The other Astartes had spoken. "Is that supposed to be a joke?" "I don't understand, sir." "You told us your name. Was it supposed to be a joke? Is it some nickname?" "I don't understand. That's my name. Why would you think it's a joke?" "Caspar Hauser. You don't understand the reference?" Hauser shook his head. "No one's ever—" The Astartes turned his beaked visor and glanced at his companions. Then he looked back down at Hauser. "Clear the area." Hauser nodded. "Once the security of this area can be guaranteed," said the Astartes, "your team may be permitted to resume its duties. You will evacuate to the safe zone and await notification." No notification ever came. Boeotia fell, and the Yselti line came to an end. 16 months later, by then working on another project in Trans-Siberia, Hauser heard that conservator teams had finally been let into the Boeotian lowlands. There was no trace that any shrine had ever existed. And unfortunately, due to battery concerns, I'm going to have to cut this off here. There's a little bit more in this chapter. Maybe I'll finish that up next week. Thanks for joining me, guys. I will talk to you all soon, and hope everyone has a good week, and I'll see you next time.